So I had a man intensely challenge one of my posts recently that I made about the sacredness of the body and particularly the sacredness of our pleasures and sexual pleasure most significantly. And he seemed to question this assertion that I was making that I believe that sacred sexuality, for example, and the conscious lovemaking can be truly such an incredible force in the world that it can be a world-changing force, a life-changing force for many people. And he was sort of incredulous about this, and I wanted to sort of break that down a little because I know when we make these kinds of assertions with sacred sexuality being this kind of universal panacea, it can bring up an element of woo-woo-ness, new age woo-woo-ness in people. And I want people to understand that a lot of the work and the writing that I do around sacred sexuality and conscious partnership and divine romance, as I call it, is not some kind of light thing. I'm not necessarily trying to, sex sells. We all know that. I'm not trying to sensationalize sex and try and get more likes or more followers. This is something that I truly love and something that I've traveled with a lot of my own woundedness around sexuality. And sex sells for a reason. It's on people's minds. It's one of the most greatest pleasures we'll ever feel in our life is sexual pleasure. And to fall in love with someone is one of the most captivating experiences. So I do think that these are big subjects, and of course I understand, because over the years I've written and taught about these things, it's of course ruffled a lot of feathers because we come from a culture that is still very oppressed and repressed around sexual energy. So in a lot of ways I'm not surprised when I'm met with this kind of stolid defensiveness that can even, catalyze some kind of uh, uh, really heated, vehement kind of attacks. Because the sexual wound is very tender, it's very vulnerable, and it brings up a lot in people. A lot of people are displeased with their loving and sexual and their intimate life. And there's a lot of sexual frustration there. And then there's a lot of generational trauma as well. But sacred sexuality truly is this burgeoning paradigm that is starting to become more and more popular for good reason. And there's a lot of science that is now coming out that's starting to verify that when we take a more skillful approach to our sex, and when I say skillful, I mean upgrading and learning how to make love in healthier ways than most of us have been taught and conditioned. Because let's face it, our sexual education is a tremendous paucity of wisdom. There's not much there. A lot of people have been poorly educated around this subject. And then, of course, we have the whole epidemic of pornography that most people go into porn, and that's where they tend to learn and see sexual experiences happening for the first time. And we need to change that because those are not necessarily healthy modes of sexuality. In sacred sexuality, and there's a whole diversity of expressions of it, so don't take what I'm about to say as the hard and fast way. In some ways, this is what I like to teach people about this subject, is that we're all pioneers in this, we're all explorers in this. So it is about having a creative expanse where we can just sort of feel into things, try and experiment in our own lives and our own lovingness. But one thing that I've seen that is kind of foundational in a lot of the sacred sexual writings and teachings across the board is this idea of slowing down the sexual experience, letting it become integrated with a certain mindfulness and meditative quality so that we can really expand the feelings that we feel in our sensual body. A lot of sex that we see in things like pornography and what people might think are more conventional sex is a very fast, rapid experience. It's the gyrating bodies coming together in coitus. It doesn't last very long. It's measured by the man's ejaculation. And there's not a lot of emphasis on caressing each other, on using touch as a form of healing and even prayer, and really taking our time to be with the breath and expanding the sexual energy to the point where we can start to circulate it throughout the body and start to really build up the capacity or the capaciousness of the body to feel realms of pleasure that many of us may even think is not even possible. This kind of idea of bliss, this sexual bliss. And of course, most of us touch that when we have the actual orgasm. We have this kind of absolute surrender to this like pinnacle of pleasure. But in a lot of sacred sexuality traditions, they actually advised to try and move away from seeing this goal-orientated sex revolving around the orgasm as kind of the end point. When we remove that from the sort of journey, it is more of a journey. It becomes more of this adventure of exploration where it can go on for much longer. And this is, of course, where the relaxation is very important. Because when we relax, when we're not as tense and we're not as fast and rapid, we allow ourselves to have this much more elaborate and expansive experience of sexual pleasure. And science has now confirmed that when this type of sex arrives and is engaged, there's a lot more harmonic chemistry that happens within the body. I'm talking about oxytocin in particular gets produced a lot more, and this is known as the love or the cuddle hormone. And we're just starting to really understand more about the endocrine system in the body, and the oxytocin chemical has this profound effect of healing many things in the body. Heals our cravings, our compulsions. It's kind of like seeing sex as a mood medicine, if you will. It makes us feel that elevated sense of being loved, of being whole, being holy even. And I've experienced in my own life when I don't have an ejaculation and I actually just allow that sexual energy to continue to expand in kind of waves where you're taking breaks and allowing this balloon to just go bigger and filling the body, that I feel this kind of love, this kind of natural high for days, for days. And it's not like I'm tripping out having mystical experiences the whole time, but I can feel this kind of beautiful, delicious energy within my body. I feel more loving towards myself, my partner, towards all the experiences and relationships in my life. It's probably the most supreme mood medicine I've ever encountered. Rather, on the other hand, science tells us that when we have an orgasm, and this goes not only for men but for women, that it's actually an experience of neurochemistry. We actually explode all this dopamine in the brain. That's the kind of rush that happens when we orgasm. But we found that after the fact, we go into this disequilibrium around the dopamine reward circuitry of the brain, where we can actually be in a dopamine deficit, where the receptor cells actually shrink and we don't produce as much dopamine. So this can last for about a week to even 2 weeks. And dopamine rules over our sense of craving. It's kind of that eros, that desire to do something, that sense of motivation, which is why this can be so crippling to people if they don't really understand and they're victims of all their biology in these ways. So when we have this deficit in dopamine, we don't feel kind of rewarded in the same way by things. So those compulsions grow stronger because we're always striving and craving something with greater depth. But no matter what we take, even if it was the sex or the food that we just had before the orgasm, it doesn't fill us in the same way because there's this deficit now with the dopamine receptors having shrank. And this is why people start to feel that the grass is always greener, or all of a sudden they want another partner. They look at their partner, they don't feel the same sense of love. And biology kind of has this little game it plays with us because we found that one of the only things that spikes dopamine up back into levels of harmony is novelty. And this kind of explains the porn cycle that happens to a lot of people, where they might start looking at porn in more conventional scenarios, and then before they know it, they're into really strange and more extreme forms of pornography to get them to that heightened pleasurable response, and that can kick into a lot of the shame cycle, and it can go into this real downward spiral. And this explains a lot of drug addiction patterns. And it's interesting because they've actually shown that brains on porn pretty much resemble the same as heroin addicts. So it is starting to realize, for a lot of us, we're starting to realize that the sex act itself needs to be treated in a skillful way, because it can actually really throw off the chemistry inside the body. So in reflection to this individual's challenge to me, I do think in this kind of context, sacred sexuality can have a huge life-changing and world-changing effect, because when we start to realize that we can take this kind of intention to heal, to bring more wholeness and more harmony into our endocrine system, for example, into this inner chemistry, into our moods, we can actually provide ourselves with one of the most powerful psychological, spiritual medicines that is available to us. And it's in the beauty of this union between two people that it can be experienced, which is so profound in itself. And it enthuses the bonds of love if people choose to be in monogamous partnerships. When we choose to be on a more sacred sexual path, it can actually enthuse and make those partnerships much more long-lasting, because we aren't victimized by all these swells and different chaoses of emotional and mood swings that can occur when we're having sex in a way that may be blowing out the circuitry within ourselves. So that's something to really contemplate. And this is why I think the sacred sexuality paradigm is so important, and why my book Love's Revolution is titled such. I do think it's a revolution that can truly change the world. Bliss is our birthright, and I hope that everyone can experience the beautiful energy of sacred sexual bliss.